Hello, and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Rose Lucibello, Manager of Advancement Events at York University. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture, our first for 2024. Today's session is titled, Surviving Our Fiery Future, Learning to Live with Wildfires, presented by Dr. Eric Kennedy, Associate Professor, Disaster and Emergency Management in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. I accept the responsibility to acknowledge the land I am on. Because we may not be gathered in the same place, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you are on. Please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, we'd like to conduct a quick poll before each session begins. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? This poll should pop up on your screen right now. Thank you. It's helpful for our speakers to know more about who is in our audience. If you need help with the Zoom webinar, feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team is ready to help you. That same button may be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period. Please note that all of your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and staff working behind the scenes, and we ask that you please keep your comments relevant and respectful. Now, I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Eric Kennedy. In addition to working as Associate Professor of Disaster and Emergency Management, he is a disaster sociologist and a wildfire social scientist. His work focuses on how we make decisions and respond to uncertainty in the context of wildfire and other hazards. He's the incoming editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Emergency Management and the Associate Director of York University's Emergency Mitigation, Engagement, Response, and Governance Institute, also known as Y-Emerge. We are pleased you can make the time to join us today. Welcome, Dr. Kennedy. Please feel free to share your screen, and I will be back to join you for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, and I'm really excited about our conversation today. I also really would warmly welcome questions you might have during this presentation, so please do feel free to use that chat and Q&A function below so that you can submit your questions so that we can discuss them later. That's always a highlight of these conversations. Our country is a country of wildfire. Our landscapes are shaped by its forces, and our communities are battered from time to time. Fire shapes who we are as a country, even as we sit here, for me, in Toronto, in a conveniently fire-free southern peninsula of this country with a snowy scene outside. Fire continues to shape who we are as a nation. On average, in a typical season, about 2 million hectares burn across this country. That's about the size of half of the province of Nova Scotia, and it burns through about 8,000 fires from coast to coast. These fires are ecologically essential for many of the ecosystems in Canada. For our boreal forests, for grasslands, for mountainous ecosystems, they have species that have adapted to the presence of fire and in fact require the presence of fire to survive. Our ecosystems, for instance, depend on fire to help clear the path for sunlight to nourish new plants. They depend on fire to help melt the wax of serotinous pine cones that can allow the seeds to propagate. They depend on fire to help keep different forms of pest and disease at bay. But unfortunately, fires also have significant consequences for those of us who choose to live and build and work and play in the very flammable landscapes that make up our country. We've often talked about this historically as what we call the wildland-urban interface, though I'd suggest that the term intermix might be more accurate. We really have intertwined ourselves with these fiery landscapes, sharing not just a single interface, but spreading massive and expensive settlements through forested hills. We've developed oil and timber and electrical infrastructure throughout boreal regions that are prone to burning. And all too often, we forget that indigenous communities have long called these regions home and been part of this intermix as well. These fire events are visceral and they're significant. In 2016, for instance, Canadians were transfixed by the fire here in this photo, the fire unfolding in Fort McMurray. In a matter of only a few hours, a fire that had simmered beside the town for several days shifted with the wind, and it came through the town, forcing the evacuation of about 88,000 people on a single highway running north and south through the town. It took 2 months and a massive change in the weather conditions for that fire to be brought under control. And in fact, that fire wasn't extinguished until August of the next year, over a year later. In 2017, the next year, fire showed a different face in British Columbia, where twice as many hectares were burned, but through a bunch of simultaneous fires that pushed the agency to the brink. There were days where tens or hundreds of fires were starting per day. When I started working on wildfire many years ago, I was often met with pretty quizzical looks about why I had chosen this topic. Unfortunately, nowadays, after the fire season we experienced here in Canada last year, very few people are asking me that question now. I mentioned earlier that in a typical fire season, we burn about 2 million hectares across this country. Last year, we burnt over 18 million hectares. That is larger than the entirety of New Brunswick and the island of Newfoundland combined. Just a huge, huge amount of area to burn. For many of us here in the East, in Toronto, in Ottawa, elsewhere, we experience the fire season most directly through its smoke impact. The picture you see here is a photograph from New York City of the yellow skies that descended, and we saw these stories coming out of many major areas like in Ottawa. And even if the scenes weren't as dramatic here in the Greater Toronto area, we still were breathing smoke for several months at lower concentrations all around the Greater Toronto area, Hamilton, southwestern Ontario. For months of the summer, there were small amounts of wildfire smoke in our air that we were breathing in. One of the big movements in my field, the field of disaster and emergency management, is to try to get people to stop calling things like tornadoes or floods or hurricanes natural disasters. I know this might sound like me being a pedantic professor, but for those of us who study this, there's a critical difference between what we would call a hazard and a disaster. Hazards are things like a pile of snow on a steep hill that's ready to tumble down in an avalanche. A hazard is something like a fault line that lies below the surface and is periodically ready to shift or shake, like some of the eruptions we're seeing in Iceland right now. But disasters, those are the outcomes. So a disaster happens when we lose things we care about: people, homes, access to food, communities. And the disasters aren't natural. Well, there might be a natural element in that chain that gets us to a disaster. A hazard alone cannot cause a disaster to happen. Disasters only happen when people die because of the buildings that we built collapsing, or they happen when our supply chains are vulnerable and leave people without food or water or electricity or medicine. They happen when we fail to adequately respond to an ecological or an environmental or a physical event and let those who are affected fend for themselves. In other words, hazards don't have moral valence, right? If a tree burns in the forest and no one is there to watch it, it's not a disaster. It's only when us pesky humans start putting things and people that we care about in harm's way that disasters occur. So wildfire is like this, and understanding this unnatural disaster that is wildfire is really important. Fire itself is an incredibly natural process. It's one that our forests across Canada demand in order to remain healthy. In fact, they evolved with fire and because of fire, and they're now dependent on it. But as we begin to build homes and infrastructure and communities in flammable landscapes, that's when disaster can arise. And we as humans, we make these disasters worse. So one particularly nefarious way that we do this is through climate change. A friend of mine and perhaps the most famous fire historian, Dr. Stephen Pine, talks about how this is an ironic journey where we've tried to capture fire within internal combustion engines. And ironically, we've instead received fire untamed and fighting back because of it. While fires have always and will always happen, climate change multiplies their intensity. So an increase in drought events, for example, will dry out trees and brush and make it easier for fires to burn. Increased storms can blow over trees and leave changing temperatures, allowing for pests to decimate forests and leave dead matchsticks behind. Gusty winds, higher temperatures, these things push fires further and faster than they would have gone otherwise. This can, of course, lead to interesting fire behavior, in addition to small fires becoming bigger ones. Here's an example of a fire whirl. This is sometimes referred to as a fire nado, though this actually isn't a fire tornado. This is a fire whirl. We, in fact, had a fire tornado this year in Canada, where the storm clouds that were generated by the fire, which I'll talk about in just a minute, created an actual tornado. These fire whirls are much smaller local phenomenon, but they are a kind of neat fire party trick of intense fires. Bigger fires can even affect the weather around them. So a very large-scale fire can create what's shown here, a pyrocumulonimbus cloud. This is essentially a thunderstorm that is created by the rising heat from a forest fire. These thunderstorms can result in lightning being sent kilometers away, in fact, up to 20, 30 kilometers ahead of the fire front. And that lightning can ignite new blazes that contribute to the spread of the fire. The winds involved with this can also send embers, or what we might call firebrands, flying through the air up to about 5 or 10 kilometers in advance. And when those embers land, they also create spot fires that can allow the fire line to move faster and perhaps trap in different crews or communities. Fires in Canada can even overwinter, survive the conditions we're seeing outside. They burrow themselves below the snow line, the frost line, and emerge again in the spring when conditions have warmed up and dried out. I mentioned earlier that the Fort McMurray fire survived for more than a year. That's because it got into the peat underground where it was able to smolder, and when things dried out, it came back up. And as we're speaking, this is occurring with some of the fires in the Northwest Territories from earlier this season. They are likely underground, still smoldering below these minus 30-degree temperatures, and may well emerge again next year as new fires starts that were connected to those old ones. And so fires, particularly fires that are empowered by these climate-affected phenomenon, can be really devastating. The big challenge, though, is that there's this multiplicative effect. It doesn't end with climate change. Climate change is one of only several factors in play. It's multiplied on these others. One of them might be where we choose to live. I mentioned earlier this idea of intermixes, communities that are nesting themselves into flammable landscapes. Fires are not picky eaters. They don't care whether they're burning trees or homes. And in fact, many of the homes that get lost in fires, like the one we saw in Fort McMurray or Lytton or elsewhere, these are not ignited by the main fire front, by the fire in the forest. What's happening is that we're seeing home-to-home transmission, where embers from one house are igniting another. And so this way that we build our communities and where we build our communities multiplies with the power of climate change to create even more significant and severe fires. Another multiplier here is our past obsession with suppression. For many years, basically 100 years, we tried to put out every single fire that we possibly could. There was a policy in the United States, for instance, the 10 a.m. policy, that suggested that the best time to put a fire out was by 10 a.m. the next morning. And if it wasn't out by 10 a.m. the next morning, we'd put it out by 10 a.m. the morning after that. This obsession with total suppression creates a fuel load and builds up the ingredients for big fires later on. There's a common slogan among fire managers that a fire put out is a fire put off. And it's true. When we extinguish these smaller fires, what we're doing is we're leaving behind the fuel that accumulates deeper and thicker and is ready to burn more strongly when we have catastrophic conditions down the road. And so if we suppress small fires, we allow that fuel to remain for bigger ones. We could also talk here for hours about how demeaning and diminishing traditional burning practices of indigenous communities, failing to light up enough good fires, they're contributing to the conditions that we see today. Another multiplier, you've probably heard of the prison industrial complex, but there's a fire industrial complex as well. It's built out of this notion of total suppression, creating armies and air forces to be able to suppress fires. And it can even get more convoluted when things like what you see pictured here happen. So this is a group of inmate firefighters, prisoners who are working the fire line in the US. These folks face incredibly difficult conditions, very low pay, and cruelly often can't be rehired even into the same organizations they were fighting for, because they have a criminal record. And so they're able to work as prisoners for next to no money and then can't get a job continuing to firefight thereafter. All of these different pieces come together: the fire industrial complex, the obsession with suppression, climate change, where we build. It leads to what we're seeing today. I share this bit first because it's the bad news, and it's probably safer to start there. If you're depressed about climate change, I'm sorry, but we've got to buckle up, because wildfire reveals the many different ways that a changing climate is going to multiply with these other factors to lead to the fire loads that we saw this last year in Canada. When you combine climate with where and how we build our communities, with our inability to light good fires, with so many other factors, you get a recipe for disaster. Not a natural disaster, but a very human-caused disaster. And this is true of all sorts of other catastrophes. If we want to tackle the kinds of disasters we're going to face today and tomorrow, we need to get good at dealing with incredibly complex, multifaceted kinds of problems. So, what do we do? I've chosen this photo here because I think it exemplifies the two different paths before us. On one hand, this photo exemplifies misinformation and conspiracy theory and the weakening of institutions and some of these kinds of futile, individualistic approaches to fire. Over the past couple of years, there have been a lot of popular conspiracy theories about fire. And one of them has used images just like this to suggest that it's your political opponents who are lighting up fires. And they've used videos of these helitorches or of people using drip torches to light fires to argue that it's Trudeau or it's NDP supporters or it's whoever your opponent is who's lighting up these fires as a government conspiracy to start the blaze. Often these kinds of photos of fire efforts have been taken as evidence of conspiracy and intentional arson at a massive scale. But I think this photo can also represent some hope, right? What's actually happening here in this photo is that we're using good fire for an intentional purpose. So we would light fires like this for two different reasons. One is called a backfire. So if you have a fire that's burning through and you want to stop it from getting somewhere, you can use what's called a backfire. Basically, as the fire approaches, you light up a second fire, and the wind being sucked in by the original fire will pull the second fire back and consume the fuel that's there in the gap. That's one way we might try to slow down or stop a fire from as it approaches. We also use drip torches from helicopters or humans alike for purposes of good fire, for prescribed fire, as we would call it. So this might be to help reduce the fuel load to prevent a burn from being catastrophic when the weather conditions are bad. Or it might be for ecological benefit. I was on a burn here in Toronto early last year where fire is being used in High Park to help improve the ecosystems in the park and make them more resilient. And so the other way you can interpret this photo, what's going on here, is a story of hope and getting fire back on the landscape and building tools to manage it. And so I think this photo captures that duality of the two different paths that we could go down. So let's talk a little bit about the changes that we might need to make. I'll mention just two of them before I wrap up and we get into the conversation. So, one change might be facing and owning up to our obsession with control. We like to believe that we can control wildfire in the same way that we can manage a fireplace or a stove. Maybe that's because our history of urban fire is one where we largely have been able to get it under control. We saw 100 years ago fires that burnt down blocks of cities that really destroyed places like here in Toronto, Chicago, London, and so many others that you can think of. And we, over the years, have become quite good at managing urban fire. But in the case of wildfire, this is only a comforting myth. This notion that we have total control, that if we just have enough firefighters, we'll be able to keep fire in the places that we want it and keep it out of the places that we don't. It's a tale we tell ourselves, and it might not be true. It's overdue for us to realize that this isn't the case. At the risk of being a little bit crass, we don't have hurricane fighters that we drop into the eye of a storm to slow it down, or earthquake fighters that we send out with giant clamps to hold fault lines together. This notion that we can do that kind of intervention for wildfire has always been a little bit suspect. And I think with the climate-induced fires that we're seeing now, it's rapidly showing that this is impossible. And so we might need to think differently about this notion of control and move away from the idea that we can have total control or that the solution is to have a stronger, bigger, more national firefighting force. I'll give you an example of this with the tragic photos and images out of Hawaii from last year. We might need to start thinking, for instance, about handling fire more like we might handle flooding, right? Are there places where we shouldn't be building? Are there places where we need to use natural features to make it less likely that fire will come into our communities? And are there places where we need to get our communities ready for fire when it does come in? The equivalent of where in flooding we put our buildings on stilts, we get them out of the way of the water. Do we need to look at equivalents for fire where we acknowledge that instead of pretending we can keep fire out, say, fire is going to come through here periodically and we need to live with it. We need to build our communities in a way that, for instance, people could safely weather a blaze. What would it look like to have a community where we were able to get back in and live there and have it be inhabitable after a day or a week post-fire? This is going to require creative engineering and ecological design and sociological thinking. But we need to stop living in denial, hoping that fire can be kept out of our communities, and perhaps ask how we can build communities that are resilient in the face of these threats. I think another really tricky problem here is going to be smoke. I started off this talk by talking about the way that smoke impacted places like New York, Ottawa, but even here in Toronto. And smoke is a really underrated problem in wildfire management. I talked earlier about the notion of good fire, that we do want some fire on the landscape so that it can burn and reduce that hazard, get rid of those fuels, have those ecological benefits. There's absolutely good fire, but there really isn't such a thing as good smoke. All air pollution is bad for our health. It presents a significant health burden on how it affects people's hearts and lungs and other body systems. There's no such thing as good smoke that helps you acclimatize to more smoke or build up resilience to more smoke. We don't want people exposed to this. And in fact, perhaps one of the most counterintuitive parts is that the majority of smoke burden is not coming from the events like the one I showed you earlier in New York City, where perhaps people are taking some precautions, they're wearing masks, they're staying indoors. In fact, the majority of the health burden is from these lower levels of smoke, where it's a bit of a haze in the air, because more people are exposed to it for longer. And when you have even low levels of smoke affecting millions of people all summer long, that exposure creates chronic harms. For parts of this, we have really good solutions. So we're on the cusp of an indoor air revolution where we focus on implementing good air quality inside. This is going to have so many benefits for communities. It will help with fire smoke. If your houses, if our educational institutions, if hospitals, if libraries, if businesses have better indoor air quality, it's going to help us during our smoky summers. It's going to help with urban air pollution. It's going to help with COVID. It's going to help with the flu. It will help with so much. But there are a lot of really tricky questions about how you deal with this outside, right? Your kids want to play soccer in the summer on a somewhat hazy day. You want to be at your cottage or out camping or on the lake. These are much trickier places because people probably don't want to wear a good mask all summer long while they're outdoors. And so, how do we mitigate some of the harms involved with increasing smoke loads across the country? Figuring out this challenge is going to be really, really tricky. But what we know is that these challenges aren't going away. We need to change how we think about fire and learn to live with it rather than believing that we can eliminate it or keep it at bay. We need a new paradigm when it comes to wildfire to help us navigate this fiery future of ours. And so thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about this. And I'm really looking forward to your questions and continuing this conversation for the next, hopefully, good while. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that very timely and informative talk. And we now, as you said, have time for questions. So to our audience, some of you already have, but please go ahead and use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And for those of you who are watching via our Facebook live stream, you are also welcome to submit any questions or comments through the comment section in the video, and we will filter it back into this chat. So yeah, really excited. So I just want to start with one question. What challenges does a changing climate pose for fire managers beyond just the intensity of the fires?
Yeah, so the intensity of fire is obviously huge, and you've seen that across the country. Think back to early last season with the fires that we saw in Nova Scotia around some of the interface areas and the challenges there. But there are some unexpected challenges that we have to get ready for too. So this might be fire occurring in places where we haven't previously seen it, places where we haven't typically thought about forest fire as a problem. One example of this is in the UK, for example. We're spending a lot of effort trying to help folks across the UK get ready for a growing fire regime. And even a couple of seasons ago, we saw forest fires at the edge of London, burning in some of the exurban areas there. And so getting ready for fires affecting communities that we might not have thought of as traditional risk is really important. Another illustration of that would have been the Marshall Fire out of Colorado, where what looked just like a suburban neighborhood surrounded by grass burnt because of a fast-moving fire. That's not the kind of forested community you might think of. It's a different kind of community that's being affected. And so we need to recognize that fire can affect very different places than we used to think about. Another kind of hidden challenge is the impact of season length on fire management agencies. So in Canada, a lot of our firefighters are actually students. They're people who do this as summer jobs and then go back to school or they go to some other kind of seasonal employment. We employ people for a short period of time rather than as year-round employees. But as that fire season gets a little bit longer and a little bit longer, we at York are not changing how much we teach in a year, right? Our school year remains the same length. And so it becomes harder for the agencies to get students early enough in the season, to keep them late enough in the season. It becomes harder for us to borrow from Australia during their winter and vice versa for us to loan personnel to them during ours. And so these lengthening seasons are really going to challenge the agencies. And we might have to look at having more dependable year-round kinds of jobs to support these firefighting roles.
That's very interesting. Our first question is going to be from the audience, Jason. He actually asked it quite early into the session, so it starts with a bit of a statement. So the operation of our contemporary monetary and market systems is premised upon infinite growth, obviously at odds with the natural processes of nature. Do you project large-scale changes in these economic systems to adapt to the natural forces of nature that are projected to increase in scale, intensity, and frequency?
Jason, it's a great question, and there are so many different layers to this. One, of course, is the climate change layer, right? The way that our approach to how we do business in this world is contributing to climate change. But even if we were able to stop climate change today, we have a lot of fires pre-climate change, and we've baked in a lot of climate change already. And so we're going to continue to have challenges with that. And These kinds of economic challenges, I think, are present in lots of other forms too. I'll give you two examples real quick. One is the challenge of working with different kinds of industry in firefighting. Historically, for instance, the railways were a big problem here, and they've come a long, long way. But historically, we looked at that industry as really challenging because you got a lot of fires that started based on the rail system. So locomotives would throw off embers or shards that caused fires. But a more modern analog of this might be having companies where they want to keep things secretive in their mining or forestry operations, but then need their assets protected during the firefight. And this can be really challenging for fire agencies to manage. How do we deal with protecting these kinds of industrial assets? Another illustration of this would be how we think about timber stands in economic terms. Some of the provinces find it really challenging because they continue to have a huge amount of industrial forestry that they have to protect. And this can perpetuate this obsession with suppression. When you feel like every inch of your province is covered with forests that have to be protected for timber companies, it can be very hard to get good fire in. Even if the timber company has no plan to harvest that land, they still want it protected for future possibilities. And so I think in your question, there was this broad economic challenge leading to climate change, but also this more local one in the ways it manifests and how firefighting becomes harder. One more illustration that I'll just loop into this is our tendency to individualize problems, right? Our current economic system really tells us to focus on individuals, that it's you who has to take the steps. Think even about Smokey Bear, right? Only you can prevent forest fires. And people do have an individual role to play. You have to get your homes and your properties ready for fire. But what we've been learning about how you actually get people to prepare, number one, lots of people aren't able to on their own. They don't necessarily have the physical ability or the capacity or the money to do this. And number two, it's a common collective problem. If you prepare but your neighbor doesn't, your house is still at risk. And so we really have to talk about systematic and systemic solutions rather than fall victim to our current economic tendency of seeing every problem in individualistic, consumeristic kinds of terms.
So our next question is from Chris, and he asks, will the massive 2023 fires reduce somewhat the risk in 2024 because the highest risk areas have already been burned?
Chris, that's a great question. And yes, I mean, part of using good fire, part of the reality of even when a bad fire comes through is that there is a temporary drop in risk in that particular area. Now, keep in mind, even though we burnt 18 million hectares, there's still a lot of forests left. And so there's ample fuel remaining for us to burn. But one of the big challenges, or two, if I can mention two of them briefly. One challenge is that we actually see some of these landscapes become flammable again really quickly. It doesn't take 30 years to get back to flammable. In fact, with some of the types of trees that we're dealing with, you can be back to a flammable landscape in only 3, 4, 6 years. And so a return to being able to burn can happen quite rapidly. The other challenge is because of how intensely some of these areas are burning, because they're catastrophic fires rather than more mellow, subdued ones that are a natural part of the ecosystem. Because they're catastrophic, they end up reducing the resiliency to fire later on. And so what comes in are different species that are more prone to burning. Rather than having a healthy ecosystem from a fire standpoint, you're getting a lot of materials that will burn very quickly because of the total changeover in what the ecosystem is comprised of. And so that's why we want to use more good fire at a lower level so that we can preserve the fire resilient components of the ecosystem rather than burn them all out and replace it with even more flammable species. And so, yes, we'll see a temporary risk reduction on those 18.5 million hectares, but there's a lot more to burn and the flammability will come back pretty quickly in many of those places.
So I'm going to piggyback because there was two questions from the same audience member. And the second piece was, my father and Ontario Land and Forests were using control burns 60 years ago. Why is there still a failure for the public to recognize this practice as beneficial?
Yeah, there's such a great question. Thank you so much, Chris. And there are a couple of layers to this. We could talk about the big picture problems, right? That we've trained people to think fire is bad, that we've had these advertising campaigns, Smokey Bear, that make people afraid of fire and think it should always be put out. But there are some more local challenges as well, and I'll touch on two of them really quickly. One is that there's increasing fear about liability related to good fire. And so in the US and Canada, we need to pay lots of attention to how we reduce the risk and exposure of people using good fire as part of these government programs to potential lawsuits and the like down the road. We've seen, for instance, in the US, people arrested, people sued, who were federal burn bosses, who were doing this professionally. And so that liability fear is one that's present in the community. The other big challenge, and I think this is a much, much bigger problem than the liability piece, is that the fire loads are starving our organization of the ability to do anything else. When I started doing interviews with fire practitioners, I would ask them, oh, what are you doing during the off season? Right? You have fires in the summer, but during the winter, what do you do? And they said, no, 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 that's the wrong way to think about it. Fires are not our day job. We have day jobs. Fires take us away from our day job. And so for many of these folks, their day job might be doing prescribed fire. It might be doing risk reduction. And as the fire season gets longer and more intense, a bigger and bigger percent of their time is taken away from that preparedness job and
Mm.
put into the response piece. It also happens with budgets. We've seen this in a big way with the Forest Service, but it holds true in Canada as well. More and more of the agency budgets are getting put towards firefighting, and less is available for doing prescribed fire, for doing preparedness work, for getting ready. So as the fires become more intense, we create a feedback loop where we make it worse by repositioning all of our assets to dealing with the fire rather than the things that will reduce the likelihood of fire. And so we actually need a pretty major overhaul of how we fund fire agencies in Canada, because we make it really easy for them to get money to put fires out and very, very hard for them to have money to prevent fire in the first place or to use good fire.
Our next question is from Patrick. So, Dr. Kennedy, given your background in social science and sociology, can you share some of your insights on ways to address the various wildfire related conspiracy theories that you have referenced?
What a great question. Thank you, Patrick. And this is a really big challenge. We've seen a lot of fire misinformation. You've probably heard about the theories of space lasers and intentional fire starts. And this is a challenge. Both the spreading of misinformation and the incredible polarization that we face in society overall. There have been some efforts around things like pre-bunking, so not debunking, but trying to debunk ahead of time, as well as general science communication, where we try to get science literacy up a little bit. I am a little bit skeptical of those solutions. I think a big part of the solution is relationships. Um, People have very different values, very different folks they trust. We're in a very polarized kind of climate. And simply providing more information and having a government spokesperson say, oh no, this fire we're lighting for that reason, I'm not sure that's information that people are going to necessarily trust. Where we have seen a lot of promise has been with these fire management agencies that get into the communities ahead of time and build relationships with people on the ground. Taking time with fire rangers and forest rangers to go door to door, to meet your neighbors, to share coffee, to have relationships ahead of time, so that when something comes up, you have people asking trusted experts. You have that relationship with people with dependable knowledge rather than trying to parachute in at the last minute with education. And so this in many ways ties back to my previous answer, which is that I think a big challenge is that we're starving our agencies of the money and resources to do that advanced work because more and more of it is getting gobbled up in the firefight. And so perhaps we need to say, okay, we're going to take 10% of the money from the firefight and move it in to things like buying coffee by forest and fire rangers and holding community sessions ahead of time and building those close relationships with members of your community so that when they feel uncertain, when they have questions, they have someone they trust who they know. They say, yeah, I know Joan. She's great. She's been here before. We've seen her. I'm going to ask her rather than turning to Facebook. And so I think relationships really matter here.
So another question here from Layla. What does a fire resilient community look like? And what natural features could we use?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are both sort of natural and built kinds of features that we can use here. Um, the fire management world thinks about treatment in different areas. Some of the treatments that we might do focus on the home. This can be really simple stuff. This can be covering up air vents in ways that have protective screens on them so that those embers coming 5 or 10 kilometers ahead of the fire front can't get in to your attic. It could be changing building materials. We're looking at right now the development potentially of wildfire building codes around this country. And we need to make sure that that question is front and center as we look at other topics like building out housing stock. We heard discussion a few weeks ago about the idea of having pre-approved housing plans for building in different communities. How are those going to take into account fire building codes and making sure that those properties are fire safe, that we're not using wooden shingles, that our eaves troughs are not building up debris that could burn? And so some of the changes that are things we can make to our house. Other changes are things we might make more at the around the house or the landscape scale. So this could be changing the kinds of vegetation that you have on your property, how tall it is, how close it is to the house, how resilient it is to fire. We might want to change the kinds of plants that you're using or have more defensible space around the property so that you aren't going to have trees falling down on your home or spreading the fire in. We're also talking about how to make ecosystems healthier. And this comes back to one of Chris's earlier questions about the return of fire. What we really want to prevent future catastrophic fires is to have a mosaicked landscape, a landscape that's varied, that's patchy, that's not just one type of tree, one type of stand, but has a lot of variety within it. And so at a landscape level, we can talk about ways to make these landscapes more heterogeneous, more varied, more patchy, as ways of slowing down fire. So there are a lot of different tools and techniques that you can use, both in how you build your buildings and in the changes you're making to plants, to landscapes around you.
So Ashton has asked, what ways will electrical engineering opportunities need to consider forest fires?
Oh, electrical engineering is great, and Ashton, fantastic question. Um, One example that immediately comes to mind, if you're interested in the connection between electricity and fire, is to look at the way that we have challenges with hydro lines starting forest fires. And we've obviously seen this in the United States with PG&E, with different fires that have been started by downed lines or touching or arcing lines. And so there's a huge need to think about the intersection between fire and electricity there. You also, of course, can have more local electrical faults starting in buildings that could lead to a fire that starts as a home fire and becomes a wildfire. We also have to deal with the firefighting capacity of this and the question of how we allow communities to return earlier and with less damage. So what does it look like to build a resilient electrical grid where we can get the community up and running again after a fire has come through it? These are all huge questions for electrical engineering, and there's tons of crossover. Would be happy to talk with you more about that.
Great. Victoria has asked, what are avenues of volunteering within fire management within the very GTA? Administrative, operations, on the ground, what options are there?
Fortunately, and I hope this continues to be the case, we don't have to deal with a lot of forest fire here in the GTA. And so there isn't volunteering with fire services in the same way as you might find in towns across Ontario or around Canada. That said, there are a couple of ways that you can get more involved. I mean, one is to look at restoration of ecosystems here in the Greater Toronto Area. There are several parks that use prescribed fire as part of their park ecosystem protection. And so getting involved with some of the Go Green initiatives across the city, getting involved with volunteering in the parks, is a way to learn more about this. In fact, I believe there are some volunteer opportunities that happen around that prescribed fire here in Toronto in High Park to share information and connect with bystanders. And so you can reach out more for that. There also are opportunities to volunteer in some of the relief operations that happen post-fire as well. These aren't places where you're going to jump into the front lines on the very first day, but there are opportunities to connect with things like the Red Cross if you want to do relief work, to connect with the city if you want to do sustainable volunteering that will lead towards potentially opportunities to plug in with fire down the road.
Great. So we have reached time, but I'm going to merge two of these questions because they had a similar kind of ask. And then this will be our final question, Eric. So thank you so much. It's been really great and informative. So two of our audience members have asked or referred to the ways that Indigenous peoples manage fire. Good fire knowledge was being used, and they used to do kind of made a reference to coal train spark fires and Indigenous communities doing something similar. And both are kind of interested in seeing, is there ways to model, the management, using the ways that these Indigenous communities do it? Are there ways for that to be applied?
There is so much learning that has to happen on the basis of respectful relationships and learning relationships with Indigenous expertise. Indigenous communities have been firekeepers for a very, very long time, since time immemorial, across this country and so many countries. And so a relationship that's built on learning and authentic trust and relationship building is so important. Martin, to your question about how you restore these relationships or restore these fires, a lot of it is relationship. A lot of it is connecting with the right folks, with building those relationships so that Indigenous-led burns can become part of our planning environment, become part of how we manage fire, and can be supported in a meaningful way. And I warmly welcome you to reach out if you want to talk further about that. I also really appreciate what Kira asked and the way you brought up this question of colonialism and neocolonialism, because it can be really easy to see Indigenous fire as a solution that we are going to drop into our Western fire models. And if we just extract that knowledge and extract that solution from Indigenous communities, we'll deploy it how we want and we'll get better outcomes. And that really cannot be how this relationship looks. It has to involve respect. It has to involve relationship building. It has to involve not just taking in a tokenistic way Indigenous practices and trying to co-opt them as our own, but really working in a meaningful way with Indigenous communities and Indigenous collaborators. The First Nations Emergency Services Society out in British Columbia is a great example of this, as are many Indigenous burn groups, fire groups, and fire response organizations that exist coast to coast. And so making sure that this is an equitable and meaningful relationship and not just stealing ideas for us to use is so critical to this process. So thank you both for those questions.
That's great. This has been a really informative and interesting talk. And I will say that when you reminded us of the air quality in Toronto in that summer, I had actually forgotten about it. And so this is, even though we may not feel like we are usually kind of affected, that was definitely, for those of us who are here in the GTA, our time to also experience it. So that was really interesting. But thank you so much, Dr. Kennedy, for being with us and giving us the time. And we're really appreciative.
Thanks so much. And I would really warmly welcome folks to reach out if they want. My email is just ebk@yorku.ca, and happy to continue any conversations that are fire related. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to listen to me share.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Kennedy. You are now welcome to turn off your video. And we do have one more poll question for you, our audience. How would you rate your knowledge for today's topic following this discussion? It will pop up on your screen right now. Scholars Hub will be back on Wednesday, January 31st at 12 p.m. for Getting to Know Africa and Its People, Confronting Popular Stereotypes with Dr. Joseph Mensah, Professor of Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change Studies, for a talk about climate change. for talk about that. To register for that event and learn more about our upcoming sessions at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Thank you and be well.